He was born into a world most of us will never know. A world where his mother's face was just a voice in the darkness. Where colors were concepts he couldn't grasp, and light was nothing more than warmth on his skin. For 12 years, David Mitchell lived in complete blindness. His mother, a self-made billionaire who had conquered every challenge life threw at her, stood powerless before the one thing money couldn't buy, her son's sight. The doctors had given up. The specialists had walked away. But on one cold November night, she made a decision that would either save her son or destroy him forever. What she did next would challenge everything we think we know about the limits of medicine, the bonds of motherhood, and the terrifying price of hope. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Mitchell didn't come from wealth. She grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit, where the heat didn't always work and dinner was sometimes just crackers and peanut butter. Her father left when she was 6, and her mother worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Sarah learned early that if she wanted something in this life, she'd have to take it herself. No one was coming to save her. By the time she was 25, she had started her first tech company in her garage with borrowed money and a dream that most people told her was impossible. 10 years later, she sold that company for $800 million. The girl from Detroit had become one of the youngest female billionaires in America. She appeared on magazine covers, spoke at conferences, and built an empire that employed thousands of people. But success came with a price. The late nights turned into early mornings. The business trip stretched into weeks. She missed birthdays, school plays, and quiet moments that she told herself she'd make up for later. When she married Thomas, a quiet architect who loved her despite her chaos, she promised things would slow down. They didn't. And when David was born on a rainy Tuesday in March, Sarah was in Tokyo closing a deal. She flew back 3 days later, exhausted and guilty, carrying a stuffed elephant she'd bought at the airport. She didn't know yet that her son had been born blind. The doctors explained it to her in clinical terms that felt like bullets. Labor congenital amaurosis, a rare genetic condition that caused severe vision loss at birth. David's retinas couldn't process light properly. The photoreceptor cells that should have been developing were damaged beyond repair. There was no cure, no treatment, no hope, they said with sympathetic faces that made Sarah want to scream. She sat in that hospital room, holding her 3-day-old son, and felt something she'd never experienced in her entire life, complete and utter helplessness. All her money, all her connections, all her success meant absolutely nothing in that moment. Thomas cried quietly beside her, but Sarah couldn't cry. She was already thinking, already planning, already refusing to accept what they were telling her. Because Sarah Mitchell had never accepted no as an answer before, and she wasn't about to start now. But as the months turned into years, reality began to wear her down in ways that no business failure ever could. David grew up in darkness, but he grew up brilliant. By age 3, he could identify people by the sound of their footsteps. By 5, he had memorized the layout of their entire house and moved through it with a confidence that broke Sarah's heart. He loved music, especially piano, and would sit for hours listening to recordings, his small fingers tapping along to melodies he couldn't see but somehow understood completely. He asked questions constantly. What does red look like? How do you know when someone is smiling if you can't hear it in their voice? Why do people care so much about things they see when there's so much to hear? Sarah would answer as best she could, but every question felt like a reminder of what he was missing. What? She couldn't give him. The other children at his special school were kind, but David knew he was different. He could hear it in the way teachers spoke to him, slow and careful, as if blindness had somehow affected his mind too. He could sense the pity from strangers when Sarah took him out in public. And worst of all, he could feel his mother's guilt like a weight in the room. Heavy and suffocating, even when she tried to hide it. Sarah spent the first 10 years of David's life searching for answers. She flew him to specialists in Boston, New York, London, Singapore, and Tel Aviv. She paid for experimental trials that showed promise in mice but failed in humans. She funded research grants and attended medical conferences where doctors spoke in language she had to learn like a foreign tongue, just to keep up. Every appointment followed the same pattern. Hope, tests, waiting, and then the inevitable letdown. The condition was too rare. The damage too extensive. The technology wasn't there yet. Maybe in 20 years, they'd say. Maybe in your son's lifetime. But not today. Not now. She spent over $40 million chasing maybes, and all she had to show for it was a filing cabinet full of medical records that said the same thing in different words: impossible. Thomas begged her to stop. Not because he didn't want David to see, but because he could see what the search was doing to her. She barely slept. She barely ate. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning researching obscure medical journals, convinced that somewhere out there was an answer everyone else had missed. Their marriage became a quiet kind of broken, too. People living in the same house but existing in different worlds. He focused on David's happiness. She focused on David's healing. Neither of them was wrong, but neither of them could reach each other anymore. When David turned 11, something shifted. He came home from school one day and asked his mother to stop looking for a cure. He said it simply, the way children do when they've thought about something for a long time and finally found the courage to speak it out loud. He told her he was okay with being blind. That he didn't need to be fixed. That he just needed her to be his mom instead of his doctor. Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. She tried to explain that she was doing this for him, that she just wanted him to experience the world the way everyone else did. To see a sunset or his own reflection or her face. David touched her cheek gently and said something that would haunt her for years. He said he didn't need to see her face to know what she looked like. He said he knew she was beautiful because her voice was kind even when she was sad, and her hands were soft when she held his, and she smelled like lavender and coffee in the mornings. He said he already knew her better than sight could ever show him. That night, Sarah sat in her office and cried for the first time since David was born. She cried for the years she'd lost chasing miracles. She cried for the mother she should have been. And she cried because somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that David didn't need to be saved. He just needed to be loved. She decided to stop searching. She promised Thomas and David both. No more doctors. No more trials. They would focus on being a family again. And for 6 months, she kept that promise. They took vacations. They had dinner together every night. Sarah cut back her work hours and started reading to David before bed, something she hadn't done since he was small. Life became quieter, gentler, almost normal. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, Sarah hadn't really stopped searching. She just learned to search in secret. It started with an email. A spam message, really, the kind Sarah would normally delete without reading. But it was 2 in the morning and she couldn't sleep, and the subject line caught her. New neuroplasticity study shows promise in vision restoration. She almost deleted it. Anyway. She'd seen 100 emails like this over the years, all leading to dead ends or scams. But something made her click. The email referenced a study conducted 7 years ago at a research facility in Prague. A small trial involving 12 patients with various forms of congenital blindness. The theory was radical. What if the problem wasn't just the eyes, but the brain's inability to process visual information it had never learned to interpret? The study used a combination of transcranial magnetic stimulation and sensory retraining to essentially teach the brain to see, bypassing some of the damaged pathways and creating new ones. According to the email, 3 of the 12 patients showed measurable improvement. 1 had even regained partial vision. Sarah's hands were shaking as she read. This was exactly the kind of thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't chase anymore. But she couldn't stop. She spent the next week tracking down everything she could find about the study. It wasn't easy. The research had been published in an obscure Czech medical journal and then seemingly buried. No follow-up studies. No mainstream coverage. Nothing. When she finally found the lead researcher, Dr. Helena Moravec, the woman wouldn't talk to her. Sarah called 17 times before Dr. Moravec finally answered, and when she did, her voice was cold and cautious. She told Sarah the study had been shut down. That the medical board had deemed it too risky to continue. That one of the patients had suffered a severe seizure during treatment and nearly died. The success stories, she said, weren't as successful as the data suggested. Yes, some patients had responded to light, but true functional vision was never achieved. The cost was too high for the minimal results. Sarah pressed harder, offering money, resources, anything. Dr. Moravec hung up. But Sarah didn't give up. She hired a private investigator to find the patients from the study. Most of them refused to talk. 1 had died in an unrelated accident. 2 had moved and couldn't be traced. But 1 patient, a woman named Elena, agreed to a video call. Elena was 34 years old and had been born with a condition similar to David's. She'd participated in the Prague study when she was 27. When Sarah asked if it had worked, Elena paused for a long time. Then she said something that changed everything. She said she could see shadows now. Not perfectly, not clearly, but she could tell when someone walked into a room. She could distinguish between light and dark. She could see the outline of her daughter's face when the sun came through the window in the morning. It wasn't the vision most people had, but it was something. It was more than nothing. Sarah asked about the risks. Elena didn't sugarcoat it. The treatment had been brutal. Weeks of intense stimulation that left her disoriented and sick. Migraines that felt like her skull was splitting open. Moments where she thought she was losing her mind. And the seizure, the one that had shut down the study, had happened to the patient right next to her. She'd heard the screams, the crash of equipment, the panic in the doctors' voices. It had been terrifying. But when Sarah asked if she regretted it, Elena said no. Because for the first time in her life, she could see her daughter. Even if it was just an outline, even if it was just shadows and light, it was hers. She could see. Sarah ended the call and sat in silence for hours. She thought about David, about the life he'd built in darkness, about how happy he seemed now that she'd stopped trying to change him. She thought about Thomas and the promise she'd made. She thought about the seizure, the risks, the very real possibility that she could hurt David instead of helping him. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a terrible idea. But there was another voice too, quieter but persistent, asking a question she couldn't ignore: what if this was his only chance? Sarah didn't tell Thomas right away. She told herself she was just gathering information, researching, being thorough. But the truth was, she knew he'd try to talk her out of it. So she worked in secret, reaching out to doctors who might be willing to consult privately, looking for anyone who had continued research in neural plasticity and vision restoration after the Prague study ended. She found Dr. Marcus Chen, a neuroscientist in San Francisco who had been following similar theories but had never published due to lack of funding and institutional support. When Sarah offered to fund his research privately, he was interested but cautious. He reviewed David's medical records and said there was a theoretical possibility that targeted neural stimulation combined with intensive visual training could create new pathways in David's brain. But he was very clear about the risks: seizures, permanent neurological damage, psychological trauma. The treatment would be aggressive, painful, and there was no guarantee it would work. In fact, statistically, it probably wouldn't work. Sarah asked him what the chances were. Dr. Chen said maybe 15%. Maybe. Sarah thought about those odds. 15% chance of success. 85% chance of failure or worse. Any reasonable person would walk away. But Sarah wasn't thinking like a reasonable person anymore. She was thinking like a mother who had spent 12 years watching her son live in darkness, and she couldn't shake the image of Elena seeing her daughter's face for the first time. She knew she had to tell Thomas. She waited until David was asleep and then sat him down in the living room with 2 glasses of wine neither of them touched. She told him everything: the email, the study, Elena, Dr. Chen, the 15% chance. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked her one question: does David want this? Sarah didn't answer right away. Because she didn't have a good answer. David had asked her to stop searching for a cure. He'd told her he was happy. He'd adjusted to his life in ways that amazed her every day. This wasn't about what David wanted. This was about what Sarah couldn't let go of. Thomas saw it in her face. He told her she was being selfish. That she was risking their son's safety, his mental health, his happiness, all because she couldn't accept reality. He said she was going to hurt David, and she was doing it for herself, not for him. Sarah wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that she was doing this out of love. But somewhere deep down, she wondered if Thomas was right. Was this about David? Or was it about her own inability to accept failure? They fought for hours. Thomas said if she did this, he'd leave. He said he couldn't watch her destroy their son in the name of saving him. Sarah said she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. The words hung between them like broken glass. That night, Thomas slept in the guest room. In the morning, he was gone. He'd left a note saying he was staying at his brother's place, and that he needed time to think. Sarah stood in their empty kitchen, surrounded by the life she'd built, and realized she was about to lose everything. But she still couldn't let go of that 15% chance. The hardest part was telling David. She waited another week, trying to find the right words, the right moment. Finally, she sat him down at the kitchen table and explained everything as honestly as she could. She told him about the study, about the risks, about the possibility that he might be able to see. She told him it was dangerous and that there was a good chance it wouldn't work. She told him she'd understand if he said no. David sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his sightless eyes pointed in her direction. Then he asked her why she wanted to do this. Sarah's voice cracked when she answered. She said she wanted him to see the world. To see colors and faces and sunsets. To see her. David reached across the table and found her hand. He said he didn't need to see her to know her. He said he was afraid of the treatment. Afraid of the pain, afraid of what might happen if it went wrong. But then he said something that broke her heart and gave her hope at the same time. He said if it was really important to her, he'd do it. Not for himself, but for her. Because he could hear how much she needed this, and he loved her too much to say no. Sarah realized in that moment that she was asking her 12-year-old son to risk everything because she couldn't let go. She was asking him to be brave so she didn't have to admit defeat. And he was saying yes because he loved her. It was the most selfless and heartbreaking thing she'd ever witnessed. She almost stopped right there. Almost called the whole thing off. Almost chose her son's safety over her own desperate hope. Almost. But she didn't. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The treatment began in March, exactly 12 years after David was born. Dr. Chen had set up a private facility in his research lab, away from hospitals and medical boards and anyone who might shut them down. It was just him, 2 nurses, Sarah, and David. Thomas still hadn't come home. Sarah had begged him to be there, but he refused. He told her he couldn't watch. That if she was going to do this, she was doing it alone. So she was alone, standing in a cold medical room while they attached electrodes to her son's head and explained a procedure she didn't fully understand. The first phase was transcranial magnetic stimulation. The goal was to stimulate the visual cortex, the part of David's brain that should process sight but had essentially been dormant his entire life. Dr. Chen explained that they were trying to wake up neural pathways that had never been used. It was like teaching someone to walk after 12 years of paralysis, except the pathways didn't exist yet. They had to create them. The stimulation sessions lasted 4 hours each and happened every other day for 3 weeks. David said the sensation was indescribable. Not quite pain, but not comfortable either. Like electricity buzzing inside his skull. Like his brain was vibrating. The migraine started after the 3rd session. David would curl up in bed afterward, pale and shaking, unable to speak through the pain. Sarah held him and whispered apologies he couldn't hear over his own suffering. After 2 weeks, Dr. Chen said there was measurable brain activity in David's visual cortex. Something was happening. The pathways were forming. But David was getting worse. He stopped eating. He couldn't sleep. He said he was seeing things that didn't make sense, flashes and shapes and colors he didn't have names for because he'd never learned them. His brain was trying to process information it didn't know how to handle. Sarah watched her son unravel and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Thomas called once during those 3 weeks. He asked how David was doing. Sarah lied and said he was fine. Thomas said he knew she was lying and hung up. The second phase began after a week of rest. This was the sensory retraining. They placed David in a controlled environment with specific light patterns, colors, and shapes. The goal was to teach his brain to interpret the signals the stimulation had awakened. Simple things at first: light versus dark, red versus blue, movement versus stillness. Dr. Chen said most of the Prague patients had quit during this phase. The cognitive dissonance was too much. Their brains couldn't reconcile the new information with a lifetime of darkness. David pushed through. He was exhausted, confused, sometimes scared, but he pushed through. Sarah asked him once why he didn't just stop, why he kept going when it was clearly hurting him. He said because she'd asked him to. Because he could hear how much she needed this to work. And he wanted to give her that, even if it broke him. Then came the night everything changed. It was day 23 of treatment. David had just finished another 4-hour session and was resting in the recovery room. Sarah was sitting beside him, reading a book out loud like she used to when he was small, when suddenly David gasped. Not a small gasp. A sharp, terrified intake of breath like he'd been punched in the chest. Sarah dropped the book and grabbed his hand, asking what was wrong, if she should get Dr. Chen, if he was in pain. David's whole body was shaking. His sightless eyes were wide and moving rapidly back and forth, like he was searching for something he couldn't find. Then he whispered 3 words that stopped Sarah's heart: "I see something." Sarah didn't move. Didn't breathe. She asked him what he saw, her voice barely a whisper. David said he didn't know. It wasn't clear. It wasn't like anything he'd imagined. But there was something there. Something that wasn't darkness. Dr. Chen came rushing in with his equipment, checking monitors and readings. The brain activity was off the charts. Something was definitely happening. Over the next hour, David's perception grew stronger. He said he could see light. Not just feel warmth, but actually perceive brightness and shadow. He said it was overwhelming, too much, like his brain was drowning in information. But it was there. It was real. Sarah was crying, laughing, shaking. 12 years of searching, of fighting, of refusing to give up, and finally, something was working. But Dr. Chen's face was serious. He pulled Sarah aside and told her they needed to stop. That David's brain was being overloaded. That pushing further could cause permanent damage or trigger a seizure. Sarah looked at her son, who was experiencing light for the first time in his life. And then looked at Dr. Chen. She asked for one more session. Just one more to see how far they could go. Dr. Chen said no. Said it was too dangerous. But Sarah offered him $5 million. Told him they'd come too far to stop now. Dr. Chen hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sarah knew she had him. They did one more session. David was exhausted, disoriented, barely able to sit upright. But Sarah convinced him to try. Just one more time. She held his hand while they turned on the stimulation. For the first 10 minutes, everything seemed fine. David was responding well. Describing shapes and shadows, his voice full of wonder and fear. Then his body went rigid. His eyes rolled back. His hand crushed Sarah's fingers with inhuman strength. He started convulsing. Alarms blared. Nurses rushed in. Dr. Chen was shouting orders Sarah couldn't understand over the sound of her own screaming. David was having a grand mal seizure, his body thrashing against the restraints, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. Sarah was pulled away from him, held back while they worked to save his life. All she could think was that she'd killed him. That in her desperate need to fix him, to give him sight, she destroyed the beautiful, brilliant, blind boy who had never needed fixing in the first place. The seizure lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes that felt like 4 hours. When it finally stopped, David lay still and silent, his chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Dr. Chen said he was stable but unconscious. That they wouldn't know the extent of the damage until he woke up. If he woke up. Sarah sat beside her son's bed and waited. She called Thomas, her voice broken, and told him everything. He didn't say "I told you so." He just said he was on his way. David woke up 36 hours later. Thomas was there by then, sitting on the other side of the bed, holding their son's other hand. Sarah hadn't slept. Hadn't eaten. Hadn't moved except to use the bathroom. When David's eyes opened, she held her breath, terrified of what she might see there. Anger. Pain. Emptiness. But David just looked confused. He turned his head slowly. Like he was moving through water, and his eyes focused on Sarah's face. Actually focused. Not the vague direction he usually faced when she spoke, but direct, intentional focus. Then he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken, "Mom." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. David blinked slowly and said something that would stay with her forever. He said, "I can see you. You're beautiful." Then he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Over the next 2 weeks, David's vision gradually stabilized. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. He could see shapes and colors and faces, but everything was blurry, like looking through fogged glass. Dr. Chen explained that David's visual acuity was around 20/200, meaning what a normally sighted person could see clearly at 200 feet, David could only see at 20 feet. He would likely never drive. Never read regular print. Never see the world in high definition. But he could see. He could look at his mother's face and recognize her smile. He could watch the sunset. He could see colors he'd only ever imagined. And most importantly, he was alive. The seizure had caused some temporary memory issues and lingering headaches. But there was no permanent brain damage. Dr. Chen called it a miracle. Sarah called it luck. Thomas called it the most reckless, irresponsible thing Sarah had ever done, and he was right. The legal consequences came quickly. Dr. Chen's medical license was suspended pending investigation. The facility was shut down. Sarah faced potential charges for endangering a minor and practicing medicine without a license. The headlines were brutal: billionaire mother, experiments on blind son, rogue treatment nearly kills child. When money and desperation collide, Sarah's company took a hit. Her board of directors asked her to step down temporarily. Business partners distanced themselves. The public was divided. Some people called her a hero, a mother who refused to give up on her son. Others called her a monster, a woman who had risked her child's life to satisfy her own ego. Both groups were probably right. Sarah didn't care about the legal consequences or the public opinion. All she cared about was David. But David was struggling in ways she hadn't anticipated. He'd spent 12 years building a life in darkness. He'd learned to navigate, to communicate, to understand the world through sound and touch and smell. Now, suddenly, he had vision, and his brain didn't know what to do with it. Everything was overwhelming. Bright lights hurt. Fast movements made him dizzy. He couldn't Recognize faces he'd known for years because voices didn't match the faces he was seeing. His spatial awareness was completely off because his eyes told him one thing and his years of muscle memory told him another. He bumped into furniture. He got lost in his own house. He had panic attacks in crowds because there was too much visual information to process. The world he'd been so desperate to see was now a source of constant stress and confusion. 3 months after the treatment, David asked his mother if he could stop trying to use his vision. If he could just go back to being blind because at least that made sense. Sarah's heart shattered. She realized that in giving David sight, she'd taken away his confidence, his independence, the carefully constructed world he'd understood completely. She'd meant to give him a gift, but instead, she'd given him a burden. She told him he could do whatever he needed to do to feel safe and happy. If that meant closing his eyes and living the way he had before, she would support him completely. But David didn't want to go back. Not really. He was just scared. And overwhelmed and adjusting to something no one should have to adjust to. So they worked together. Slowly. Patiently. Sarah stepped back from her company entirely and dedicated herself to helping David navigate his new reality. They hired specialists in vision therapy. They created routines and safe spaces. They celebrated small victories, David recognizing his father's face. David watching a movie for the first time, David seeing snow fall. It took almost a year, but gradually, David found his balance. He learned to integrate vision with his other senses instead of replacing them. He wore sunglasses to reduce visual overstimulation. He still used his cane in unfamiliar places. He still identified people by their voices first and their faces second. But he could see. And slowly, carefully, he began to appreciate that gift without being crushed by it. Thomas and Sarah never fully repaired their marriage. The trust had been broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. They divorced quietly 2 years after David's treatment, but they remained in each other's lives for their son. There was no animosity, just a sad acknowledgement that some choices leave scars too deep to heal. Thomas remarried eventually. Sarah never did. She threw herself into advocacy work instead, fighting for more research into neural plasticity treatments, while also advocating for stricter safety protocols and ethical oversight. She testified before medical boards. She funded legitimate research. She tried to make meaning from the chaos she'd created. The legal charges against her were eventually dropped. Dr. Chen's license was reinstated with conditions. The world moved on. David is 17 now. He's learning to drive with special visual aids, something Sarah thought would never be possible. He still loves music. But he's also discovered a passion for photography. He takes pictures of things most people overlook: shadows on walls, rain on windows, the way light filters through trees. His photos are blurry, imperfect, but there's something hauntingly beautiful about them. Something that speaks to a perspective no one else has, a view from someone who knew darkness intimately before discovering light. Sarah thinks about that night in the lab constantly. The seizure. The monitors. The moment she thought she'd killed her son. She wonders if she'd do it differently if she could go back. If she'd walk away from Dr. Chen's offer, accept David's blindness, choose safety over possibility. Honestly, she doesn't know. Because David can see now. And yes, it came at a terrible cost. Yes, she nearly lost him. Yes, she crossed ethical lines she shouldn't have crossed. But when She watches him take photographs of the sunset, or when he looks at her and smiles because he can actually see her smiling back, she struggles to regret it completely. Maybe that makes her a terrible person. Maybe that makes her a mother. Maybe it makes her both. She's learned to live with the complexity of it, the way most hard truths in life exist in shades of gray rather than black and white. David told her once, when he was 15 and they were talking late at night the way they used to, that he forgave her. He said he understood why she did it. That she was trying to give him something beautiful, and even though the path was terrifying and painful, he was grateful for where it led. He also said he hoped she'd forgiven herself, because he could tell she was still carrying guilt that didn't belong to her anymore. Sarah cried that night. She cried for the scared mother who thought money could solve anything. For the desperate woman who confused love with fixing. For the person she'd been before she learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept what you cannot change. But she also cried with gratitude. Because against all odds, against every rational piece of advice, against the 85% chance of failure, her son could see. Not perfectly. Not easily. But he could see. And in the end, maybe that's what hope is. Not the guarantee of a happy ending, but the willingness to fight for the possibility of one, even when the odds are stacked against you. Even when everyone tells you to stop. Even when stopping would be the smarter, safer choice. Sarah doesn't recommend what she did. She doesn't tell other parents in similar situations to follow her path. Because what worked for David could have easily killed him. Because 15% isn't good enough odds when the price of failure is your child's life. Because love, no matter how fierce, doesn't justify every risk. But she also can't bring herself to fully regret it. And she's learned to live with that contradiction. She sits in her living room. Sometimes, watching David through the window as he photographs the garden, and she thinks about all the choices that led them here. The good ones and the terrible ones. The moments of courage and the moments of recklessness. The price they paid and the gift they received. And she wonders, as she always will, whether the line between saving someone and destroying them is as clear as we'd like to believe. Or whether sometimes, in the most complicated moments of our lives, that line doesn't exist at all. So here's the question we're left with, the one Sarah asks herself every single day: if you had a 15% chance to give your child something impossible, something beautiful, something that could change their entire life, but an 85% chance of losing them forever, what would you do? Would you take the safe path and live with the what-ifs? Or would you risk everything for a slim chance at a miracle? There's no right answer. Sarah knows that now. She made her choice, and she'll carry the weight of it, and the wonder of it, for the rest of her life. David sees the world now through imperfect eyes, and Sarah sees her son through the lens of every choice she made to get him there. And somehow, impossibly, they're both still standing. Both still loving each other. Both still learning what it means to live with hope and fear and gratitude all tangled together. That's the thing about impossible stories. Sometimes they end in tragedy. Sometimes they end in miracle. And sometimes, if you're incredibly lucky or incredibly reckless or perhaps both, they end somewhere in between. Where the joy and the cost exist. Side by side, inseparable and true. Where you can't celebrate without remembering what you risked. And you can't regret without acknowledging what you gained. That's where Sarah and David live now. In the complicated middle. In the space between darkness and light. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly where they were always meant to be. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's position? Would you have taken the risk, or would you have chosen acceptance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make out of love and desperation, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because sometimes the most important conversations we have are about the impossible decisions we hope we never have to make. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories that challenge the way we think about courage, sacrifice, and the complicated nature of love. Thank you for watching, and remember, every decision we make in the name of love carries weight. The question is whether we're strong enough to carry it.